Thunder cracked across the Montana sky as Yates Morgan spurred his exhausted stallion forward through the deluge, squinting against the torrent that had transformed the prairie into a treacherous mire. The year was 1873, and the unforgiving wilderness of the Montana Territory cared little for the troubles of a lone cowboy caught in its fury. Yates pulled his sodden hat lower, rain streaming from its brim as lightning illuminated the barren landscape in brief, ghostly flashes. It was in one such moment that he saw a flicker of movement against the darkened horizon, something that didn't belong among the wind-whipped grasses and gnarled trees. "Steady, Thunder," he murmured to his horse, guiding the animal toward what he'd glimpsed. Another flash revealed the unmistakable silhouette of a broken-down wagon, listing dangerously to one side like a wounded animal. Approaching cautiously, hand instinctively resting on his Colt revolver, Yates dismounted and moved forward through the mud. "Hello." He called out, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "Anyone there?" No response came, but as he drew closer to the wagon, he saw her, a woman huddled against its splintered remains, her slight frame trembling violently as she tried to shield herself from the storm's wrath. Her dress, once fine by the looks of it, was torn and mudded, clinging to her like a second skin. Her dark hair hung in wet ropes around a face that, even in distress, held a delicate beauty that caught Yates off guard. She looked up at his approach, eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. "Stay back," she warned, her voice surprisingly steady despite her condition. She clutched something tightly to her chest, a small bundle that Yates couldn't make out in the darkness. "Madam, I mean no harm," Yates said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect despite the rain. "You'll catch your death out here. Let me help you." The woman regarded him warily, her breath coming in visible plumes in the cold air. "My husband," she began, then faltered. He's gone. The horses spooked in the storm, the wagon." Her voice broke as she gestured to the wreckage around them. Without hesitation, Yates unfastened his heavy wool blanket from behind his saddle. Moving slowly, telegraphing his movements to avoid frightening her further, he approached and draped it around her shoulders. She flinched at first, then yielded to the sudden warmth, drawing it tight around herself with one hand, the other still protectively cradling the bundle. "I'm Yates Morgan," he said, crouching down to her level. "I've got a cabin about 3 miles east of here. It ain't much, but it's dry and warm." He nodded toward what she was holding. "What have you got there?" The woman hesitated, then carefully pulled back a corner of the cloth to reveal the sleeping face of an infant, somehow dry and protected despite the chaos around them. "My daughter," she whispered. "Lillian." Something shifted in Yates's chest, a feeling unfamiliar to a man who'd spent the last 5 years alone, drifting from ranch to ranch, taking odd jobs and avoiding entanglements. Here was a woman and child, abandoned to the elements, with no one to rely on but a stranger. "And you, madam." "What's your name?" "Olivia," she said after a moment. "Olivia Winters." Thunder bellowed overhead and the infant stirred. Without further discussion, Yates made a decision. "Mrs. Winters, we need to get you and your child to shelter. Can you ride?" Olivia nodded, determination replacing some of the fear in her eyes. "Yes." Yates helped her to her feet, noting how she swayed slightly. He lifted her and the baby onto Thunder's back, then gathered what few possessions he could salvage from the wagon, a small carpet bag, seemingly untouched by the rain. He mounted behind her, one arm securely around her waist, the other holding the reins. "Hold onto Lillian tight," he instructed. "And lean back against me if you need to. It's not far." As they rode through the storm, Yates felt the weight of Olivia's trust in him, a stranger who'd appeared from nowhere in her darkest hour. He didn't know her story or what had truly happened to her husband, but he knew with sudden clarity that his solitary existence had just been irrevocably altered. The rain continued its assault as they made their way toward his cabin, but for the first time in years, Yates Morgan rode with purpose. The cabin came into view after what felt like an eternity, a humble structure nestled against a grove of pines that offered some protection from the elements. Smoke still curled from the chimney Yates had left in a hurry that morning, not bothering to completely extinguish the fire before riding out to check his trap lines. "There it is," he said, feeling Olivia stir against him. She'd been silent during the ride, but he could feel her trembling through the damp blanket. The baby, miraculously, remained quiet, perhaps lulled by the rhythm of the horse's gait. Thunder picked his way carefully up the muddy path to the cabin. Yates dismounted first, then reached up to help Olivia down, taking care not to disturb the infant. She stumbled slightly as her feet touched the ground, and he steadied her with a hand at her elbow. "Easy now," he murmured. "Almost there." He guided her to the porch and quickly unlocked the door, ushering her inside where the faint warmth of dying embers greeted them. The cabin was simple but functional, one main room with a stone fireplace, a small table with 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, and various necessities hanging from hooks on the walls. A ladder led to a small loft area where Yates stored supplies. "Sit by the fire," he instructed, pulling a chair closer to the hearth for her. "I'll get it going properly again." He busied himself with adding kindling and logs to the embers, methodically building it back to life. Within minutes, flames were licking at the dry wood, casting a warm glow throughout the cabin. Olivia sank into the chair, still clutching Lillian to her chest. In the firelight, Yates could see her more clearly now. She was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps mid-20s, with features that spoke of a gentler upbringing than the frontier typically afforded. Her eyes, a striking shade of green, followed his movements with cautious gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Yates nodded, uncomfortable with the acknowledgement. Anyone would have done the same. He moved to a chest near the bed and pulled out dry clothes, a shirt and pair of trousers that would be far too large for her, but better than her sodden dress. "These will swallow you whole, but they're dry. There's a screen in the corner you can change behind." He hesitated. "Do you need help with the baby?" Olivia's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. "No, I can manage. She's sleeping now, thankfully." Yates nodded and turned to tend to Thunder, giving her privacy. When he returned, Olivia had changed into his clothes, the sleeves rolled up multiple times and the trousers cinched tight with a piece of rope. Her wet dress hung over the screen to dry. She'd found a clean piece of linen in which to wrap Lillian, who remained asleep in her arms. "I'll make us something to eat," Yates said, moving to the small kitchen area. He wasn't much of a cook, but he could manage beans and bacon, and he had some bread left from his last trip to town. As he worked, he glanced occasionally at Olivia, noting how she stared into the fire, lost in thought. "Where were you headed?" he asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Olivia looked up as if startled from a dream. "Helena," she replied. "My husband Thomas had a brother there. We were going to start fresh." Her voice caught. Thomas was driving when the storm hit. The horses spooked at a lightning strike. He tried to control them, but the wagon. She trailed off, clutching Lillian tighter. "I'm sorry," Yates said simply, understanding that no words could ease such a loss. "Was it just the 3 of you?" She nodded. "We left St. Louis a month ago." Thomas had been a banker, but the panic last year cost him his position. His brother wrote about opportunities in Montana. A sad smile touched her lips. "Thomas wasn't much of a frontiersman, but he was determined to provide for us." Yates set a plate of food before her, along with a cup of coffee. "Eat, you need your strength." Olivia carefully shifted Lillian to one arm and accepted the plate with her free hand. "What about you, Mr. Morgan? What brings a man like you to such a remote place?" Yates sat across from her with his own plate. "Just Yates," he corrected, "and nothing special. Been working ranches since I was 15. Saved enough to buy this plot 2 years back. I trap in winter, work cattle drives in summer, do odd jobs in between." He shrugged. "It's a living." "No family?" she asked, then immediately looked contrite. "Forgive me, that's none of my business." "Nothing to forgive," Yates replied. "And no family, not anymore." He didn't elaborate, and Olivia didn't press. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. When they finished, Yates took the plates and set them aside. "You should take the bed," he said. "I'll make a pallet by the fire." Olivia looked about to protest, but exhaustion was clearly taking its toll. "Just for tonight," she conceded. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do." Yates helped her settle on the bed, finding an extra blanket for her and Lillian. The The baby stirred briefly, tiny fists waving in the air before settling back to sleep against her mother's chest. If she wakes hungry in the night, there's fresh milk in the cold box, Yates said. Got it from my neighbor's cow yesterday. Surprise flickered across Olivia's face. You have neighbors out here, the Johnsons, 5 miles west, good people, they have a proper farm. He arranged his bedroll near the fire. Get some rest, Mrs. Winters, you're safe now. Olivia's eyes met his, and something unspoken passed between them: gratitude, trust, and something else, something Yates couldn't quite name. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Yates nodded and turned away, uncomfortable with the emotion he saw in her gaze. He wasn't used to having people depend on him, wasn't used to being needed. As he lay down, listening to the storm rage outside and the soft breathing of the woman and child in his bed, he wondered what exactly he'd gotten himself into. But beneath that uncertainty was something else, a sense that for the first time in years, he wasn't just existing. He had purpose now, even if only temporarily, and that thought followed him into an uneasy sleep. Morning arrived with unexpected clarity, the storm having passed during the night to leave a world washed clean and sparkling with dew. Yates woke at first light, as was his habit, momentarily disoriented by the sight of Olivia and Lillian still sleeping in his bed. The baby had woken twice during the night. He'd heard Olivia's soft murmurs as she comforted the child, but now both slumbered peacefully. Moving quietly, Yates stoked the fire and put coffee on to boil. He needed to check on Thunder and assess the damage the storm might have caused to his property, but he hesitated to leave Olivia alone. His dilemma was solved when she stirred, green eyes blinking open to focus on him with momentary confusion before recognition dawned. Good morning, she said softly, careful not to disturb Lillian. Morning, Yates replied. Coffee's almost ready. How'd you sleep? Better than I had any right to, Olivia admitted, slowly sitting up. She ran a hand through her tangled hair, a self-conscious gesture that made her seem younger. Lillian was restless, but that's not unusual. How old is she? Yates asked, pouring the coffee into 2 tin cups. 4 months yesterday, Olivia said, a small smile touching her lips as she glanced down at her daughter, though with everything that happened, I nearly forgot. Yates brought her a cup, which she accepted gratefully. I need to tend to Thunder and check the property, he said. Will you be all right for a bit? Olivia nodded. Of course, please don't let us disrupt your routine more than we already have. Yates pulled on his boots and coat, stepping outside into the crisp morning air. The sky was a brilliant blue, with no hint of the previous night's fury. He made his way to the small lean-to structure that served as Thunder's shelter, finding the horse seemingly no worse for the adventure. After seeing to the animal's needs, Yates circled the cabin, checking for damage. A few cedar shingles had blown off the roof, and a young pine had fallen near the vegetable garden, but otherwise, his modest homestead had weathered the storm intact. When he returned to the cabin, he found Olivia up and moving about, Lillian awake and cradled in one arm while her mother attempted to tidy the space with her free hand. You don't need to do that, Yates said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. I want to help, she replied simply. You've done so much for us already. Lillian turned at the sound of his voice, revealing a cherubic face with bright eyes that regarded him curiously. A tuft of dark hair crowned her head, and her tiny hands opened and closed in a rhythmic motion. She's looking at you, Olivia said with a hint of surprise. She's usually wary of strangers. Yates approached cautiously, unused to being around infants. Hello there, little one, he said awkwardly. To his astonishment, Lillian's face broke into a toothless grin, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Well, look at that, Olivia said softly. She likes you. Something warm and unfamiliar unfurled in Yates's chest. He cleared his throat. Lucky coincidence, he muttered, turning away to hide his pleased expression. I should make breakfast. As he gathered eggs from the small coop behind the cabin and sliced bacon from his stores, Yates found himself contemplating the unexpected turn his life had taken. Yesterday morning, he'd been a solitary man with simple needs and few complications. Now his cabin housed a widow and her infant daughter, both of whom would need his assistance if they were to reach Helena safely. Helena was at least a week's journey, possibly more with a baby in tow. The stage passed through Copper Creek, the nearest settlement, every Tuesday and Friday, tomorrow being Tuesday. If they left today, they could make it to town by nightfall, and Olivia could be on her way to her brother-in-law's by morning. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, Yates felt a strange reluctance that he couldn't quite explain. Over breakfast, he outlined the plan to Olivia. The stage to Helena leaves from Copper Creek tomorrow morning. We could ride out today, stay at the boarding house tonight, and you could be on your way come morning. Olivia's face fell slightly, though she quickly masked it with a polite smile. That's very generous of you, Yates, but She hesitated, looking down at Lillian, who was contentedly nestled in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a drawer padded with blankets. I'm not sure I'm ready to face Thomas's brother just yet, to tell him what happened. Yates studied her, noting the shadows beneath her eyes and the way her hands trembled slightly as she pushed food around her plate. You need time, he said, understanding dawning. That's natural enough. Relief washed over her features. Just a few days, she said, to gather my strength, if that wouldn't be too much of an imposition. No imposition, Yates said, though he knew he was venturing into unfamiliar territory. He'd spent years avoiding attachments, keeping to himself except when work demanded otherwise. Yet here he was, inviting a beautiful woman and her child to remain in his home indefinitely. But I should go to town regardless, to send word to your brother-in-law that you're safe and to get supplies. Olivia nodded. Yes, of course, I'll write a letter for you to send. She glanced around the cabin. And I can manage things here while you're gone. It's the least I can do. Yates considered protesting, then thought better of it. Olivia seemed determined to contribute, and he understood the need to feel useful in times of grief. All right, he agreed. I'll leave after breakfast and should be back by supper. The ride to Copper Creek took just over 3 hours at a steady pace. The town was small but growing, with a general store, saloon, church, blacksmith, and the boarding house that also served as a stage stop. Yates's first stop was the telegraph office, where he sent a brief message to Olivia's brother-in-law, John Winters, informing him of the accident and Olivia's current situation. He paid extra for a reply, instructing the operator to hold any response until his return. Next, he visited the general store, purchasing supplies they would need: food staples, lamp oil, and after some hesitation, a few items for Lillian and Olivia. The shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Fletcher, raised her eyebrows at his requests for baby items and women's necessities, but to her credit, she asked no questions as she wrapped his purchases. It was at the saloon, where he stopped for a quick meal, that Yates encountered the first real challenge to his newfound arrangement. Sheriff Wade Calloway, a fair man who'd always treated Yates with respect, slid into the chair across from him with a look of concern. Heard you sent a telegraph to Helena, the sheriff said without preamble. Something about a woman and child staying at your place. Yates took a measured sip of his coffee. News travels fast. Small town, Calloway shrugged. Want to tell me what's going on? Briefly, Yates recounted finding Olivia and Lillian during the storm, explaining the circumstances of the wagon accident and his offer of temporary shelter. The sheriff listened intently, his weathered face revealing nothing. You check the wagon, he asked when Yates finished. Verify her story? No, Yates admitted. It was dark, pouring rain. Getting them to safety was my priority. Calloway nodded slowly. Might be worth riding out there, having a look. Not that I'm doubting the lady, you understand, but a man in your position can't be too careful. Yates bristled slightly. What position is that exactly? A single man living alone, suddenly taking in a pretty young widow. Calloway held up a hand to forestall Yates's protest. I know you, Morgan. You're not the type to take advantage, but others might wonder, and if her story doesn't check out, you could find yourself in a tricky situation. Yates knew the sheriff was right, though he didn't like the implication. I'll check the wagon on my way back, he conceded, but I'm telling you she's genuine. You can see it in her eyes. A knowing smile tugged at Calloway's lips. Just be careful, Yates. The heart has a way of seeing what it wants to see. Before Yates could respond, the saloon doors swung open to admit a group of cowboys, trail dust still clinging to their clothes. Among them was a familiar face, Henry Walsh, a man Yates had worked with on a cattle drive the previous summer. Their eyes met, and Walsh broke into a broad grin. "Yates Morgan, didn't expect to see you in town." Walsh sauntered over, clapping Yates on the shoulder. "Boys, this here's the best horse wrangler in the territory. Saved our hides when that storm spooked the herd last August." Introductions were made, and despite Yates's intention to return home quickly, he found himself drawn into conversation. The men were passing through on their way to a ranch near Helena, driving a small herd of prized breeding stock. Their trail boss had given them a day's liberty in town before the final push. "Join us for a drink," Walsh urged, "for old time's sake." Yates hesitated, thinking of Olivia waiting at the cabin. "Can't today," he said. "Got business to attend to." Walsh's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Business? You? Since when did Yates Morgan have anything more pressing than his next meal and a warm place to sleep?" The other cowboys laughed, and Yates felt a flash of irritation. Was that how people saw him? A drifter with no ambition beyond basic survival. It struck a nerve he hadn't known was exposed. "Things change," he said simply, rising from his chair. "Good seeing you, Henry. Safe travels to Helena." As he gathered his purchases and headed for Thunder, Yates couldn't shake the sheriff's warning or Walsh's casual dismissal. Both men had seen something in him that he'd never bothered to examine: a purposeless existence, a man adrift. And for the first time, that perception rankled. The wagon was where Olivia had described, tipped on its side in a muddy depression about 3 miles from where he'd found her. Yates approached cautiously, unsure what he might find. The sheriff's concerns, though irritating, weren't entirely unfounded. Strangers weren't uncommon in these parts, and not all had honest intentions. The scene told its own story. Deep ruts showed where the wagon had slid down an embankment, its momentum likely increased by the rain-slicked ground. One wheel was completely shattered, another hung at an odd angle. The contents of the wagon were scattered clothing, household items, a few books. Yates dismounted and began gathering what he could salvage, placing them in his saddlebags. Among the debris, he found a man's pocket watch, its face cracked but still ticking. Inside the cover was an inscription: "To Thomas, with love eternally, Olivia." Something about the personal nature of the item made Yates's chest tighten. He pocketed it carefully, intending to return it to its rightful owner. What he didn't find was Thomas Winters' body. Yates searched the surrounding area, following the tracks as best he could on the still damp ground. Eventually, he discovered signs of what had happened: a place where the earth had been recently disturbed, rocks piled in a crude marker. Olivia had buried her husband as best she could before seeking shelter. The reality of her situation hit Yates anew. This woman had not only survived the accident, but had managed to bury her husband and protect her infant daughter, all while exposed to one of the worst storms he'd seen in years. Her strength was remarkable. With renewed urgency, Yates mounted Thunder and headed back to the cabin, the setting sun casting long shadows across the prairie. He arrived just as twilight was giving way to full darkness, the warm glow of lamplight visible through the cabin windows. When he entered, the scene before him stopped him in his tracks. Olivia sat in a chair by the fire, Lillian at her breast, feeding contentedly. Her hair, now dry, cascaded over one shoulder in dark waves, and in the firelight, her profile was like something from a painting, serene and lovely despite the circumstances that had brought her here. She looked up at his entrance, a faint blush coloring her cheeks as she adjusted her clothing to cover herself. "You're back," she said softly. "I was beginning to worry." Yates set down his purchases, removing his hat and coat. "Took longer than I expected. I stopped by the wagon site." Something flickered in Olivia's eyes: pain, gratitude, he couldn't be sure. "Did you find anything?" Yates approached slowly, pulling the pocket watch from his vest. "This was there. Thought you might want it." Olivia's free hand trembled as she took the watch, her fingers tracing the inscription inside. "Thank you," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I thought it was lost forever." "I also found where you buried him," Yates said gently. "You did right by him, Olivia. Not many could have managed what you did, especially with a baby to care for." A tear slipped down her cheek, which she quickly wiped away. I didn't know what else to do. The horses were gone, the wagon destroyed. Thomas was, she faltered. He died instantly, I think. The wagon rolled and he was thrown. She looked down at Lillian, who had fallen asleep at her breast. I was in the back with Lillian, that's what saved us. Yates wanted to comfort her but wasn't sure how. Physical touch seemed too intimate, too presumptuous. Instead, he moved to unpack the supplies he'd bought, giving her a moment to compose herself. I sent a telegraph to your brother-in-law, he said after a pause. Told him what happened and that you're safe. The operator will hold any reply until I'm back in town. Olivia nodded, carefully shifting Lillian to her shoulder to burp her. I wrote a letter as well if you could post it next time you go. Of course, Yates agreed, then hesitated before adding, I got a few things, for you and Lillian. He gestured to the packages on the table, suddenly feeling foolish. Nothing fancy, just necessities. Curiosity overcame grief as Olivia rose, Lillian still cradled against her shoulder, to examine the packages. Inside, she found diapers, baby soap, a soft blanket embroidered with tiny flowers, and for herself, a simple but sturdy dress, a nightgown, and personal items that made her blush again. Yates, she breathed, clearly touched by his thoughtfulness. This is too much. I can't accept, you can and you will, he interrupted, more gruffly than he'd intended. You need these things, and I can afford them. It's no charity, Olivia, it's just being decent. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of something neither was ready to name. Lillian chose that moment to fuss, breaking the tension. She's tired, Olivia said, bouncing gently to soothe the baby. As am I, to be honest. Get some rest, Yates said. I'll see to supper. As he prepared a simple meal, Yates found himself contemplating the strange turn his life had taken. 3 days ago, he'd been a solitary man with no responsibilities beyond his own survival. Now he was cooking for a woman and child, buying them clothes, sending telegraphs on their behalf. And stranger still, it felt right in a way few things in his life ever had. Outside, the stars emerged one by one in the vast Montana sky, witnesses to the subtle shift occurring within the cabin's rough-hewn walls, a shift neither Yates nor Olivia fully recognized yet, but which would alter the course of both their lives irrevocably. The days that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. Yates tended to his usual chores, feeding the chickens, chopping wood, checking his trap lines, while Olivia managed the domestic affairs of the cabin with quiet efficiency. She cooked meals that were a distinct improvement over Yates's bachelor fare, kept the cabin tidier than it had ever been, and washed clothes in the stream that ran behind the property, hanging them to dry in the autumn sunshine. Lillian thrived under their shared care. Though Olivia was her primary caretaker, Yates found himself increasingly involved in the baby's daily routine. At first, his interactions were awkward, his large hands seemingly ill-suited for such a tiny being. But Lillian's immediate acceptance of him, her delighted coos when he entered a room, the way she reached for him with complete trust, gradually eroded his reservations. On the 4th morning, Yates returned from checking his traps to find Olivia in distress, pacing the cabin floor with a screaming Lillian in her arms. The baby's face was red with exertion, her tiny fists clenched tight as she wailed inconsolably. "What's wrong?" Yates asked, setting down his gear. "I don't know," Olivia said, her own face streaked with tears of frustration and worry. "She's been like this for hours. She's not hungry, she's not wet, she doesn't have a fever. I've tried everything." Without thinking, Yates held out his arms. "Let me try." Olivia looked surprised but passed Lillian to him, her expression a mixture of doubt and desperate hope. Yates cradled the screaming infant against his chest, one large hand supporting her bottom, the other gently patting her back as he began to walk slowly around the cabin. "There now, little one," he murmured, his deep voice a rumbling vibration against Lillian's tiny body. "What's got you so worked up, huh? You're giving your mama a hard time, and that ain't right." To both adults' astonishment, Lillian's cries began to subside, her rigid body gradually relaxing against Yates's broad chest. Within minutes, she was hiccuping softly, her earlier distress seemingly forgotten. "How did you do that?" Olivia asked, amazed. Yates shrugged, continuing his slow circuit of the cabin. Horses are the same way sometimes, get themselves all worked up over nothing. Sometimes they just need a change of pace, a different voice. He glanced down at Lillian, who was now contentedly gumming her fist. Reckon babies ain't so different. Olivia sank into a chair, relief evident in every line of her body. I was beginning to think I was a terrible mother, she admitted, pushing hair away from her face with a trembling hand. You're an excellent mother, Yates said firmly. Anyone can see that. Babies just have their moments, I expect. A small smile curved Olivia's lips. And who taught you so much about babies, Yates Morgan? Nobody, he admitted. Just seems like common sense. Olivia's smile widened, a genuine expression that transformed her face and sent an unexpected warmth through Yates's chest. Well, you're a natural. She adores you already. Yates looked down at the now peaceful infant in his arms, her big eyes regarding him with what did indeed look remarkably like adoration. It was a heady feeling, being needed this way, being trusted so completely. He swallowed past a sudden tightness in his throat. Guess I'd better get used to it, he said lightly. Seems I've been promoted from cowboy to nursemaid. The joke broke the tension, and Olivia laughed a clear, melodic sound that Yates realized he'd never heard from her before. It changed her entire demeanor, making her seem younger, carefree in a way she hadn't been since he'd found her in the storm. Later that evening, after Lillian had been fed and settled in her makeshift cradle, Yates and Olivia sat by the fire, sharing a pot of coffee. A comfortable silence had fallen between them, the kind that exists only between people who have begun to know each other beyond surface pleasantries. Tell me about your life before, Yates said suddenly. In St. Louis, Olivia looked surprised at the question, then thoughtful. It was. Comfortable, she said after a moment. Thomas was a good provider. We had a nice home, servants, social engagements, she sighed. But it never quite felt like my life, if that makes sense. More like I was playing a role someone else had written for me. How so? Yates asked, genuinely curious. I married Thomas when I was 18, Olivia explained. He was my father's choice, respectable, established, 15 years my senior. I was raised to be a banker's wife, to host dinner parties and sit on charity committees. A rueful smile touched her lips. I was never allowed to be more than decorative, Yates frowned. That doesn't sound much like the woman who buried her husband in a storm and kept her baby alive against all odds. Olivia looked at him sharply, as if seeing him in a new light. No, she agreed softly. I suppose it doesn't. She gazed into the fire, her expression pensive. Thomas wasn't unkind. He simply had certain expectations of what a wife should be. When the bank failed and he lost his position, it was like watching a mountain crumble. His entire identity was bound up in being a successful banker, a pillar of society. And that's why you were heading west, Yates prompted when she fell silent. Olivia nodded. Thomas was determined to rebuild. His brother had written about banking opportunities in Helena, with the gold mining operations creating a need for financial services. She sighed. I think part of him believed that if he could just restore our former life, everything would be right again. And what did you want? Yates asked, the question simpler than its implications. Olivia looked startled, as if no one had ever asked her that before. Perhaps no one had. She began, then stopped, gathering her thoughts. I wanted Lillian to grow up somewhere she could breathe, where she wouldn't be confined by the same expectations that shaped my life. I wanted. She hesitated, then continued with growing conviction. I wanted to discover who I might be outside of the roles I'd been assigned. Yates nodded, understanding perfectly. Wasn't that why he'd come west himself all those years ago, to escape the confines of expectation, to find space to become whoever he truly was? And now, he asked quietly, what do you want now, Olivia? The question hung between them, fraught with unspoken possibilities. Olivia's gaze met his, unwavering despite the vulnerability in her eyes. Now, I want to find the courage to begin again, she said simply. For Lillian's sake, and perhaps for my own. Yates felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of kindred spirits despite their different backgrounds. Well, he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended, if courage is what you need, you've got it in spades already. The rest will follow. Olivia smiled, the firelight catching the unshed tears in her eyes. "Thank you for seeing that in me," she whispered. "Sometimes I need reminding." The moment stretched between them, intimate in its honesty. Yates was acutely aware of how close they sat, of the softness of her expression, of the way her hands cradled her coffee cup as if drawing warmth from it. He wanted suddenly and powerfully to reach across the small space between them and take those hands in his own to offer comfort and connection through touch. Instead, he stood abruptly, breaking the spell. "It's getting late," he said, moving to bank the fire for the night. "We should turn in." If Olivia was disappointed by his retreat, she didn't show it. "Yes, of course," she agreed, rising as well. "Good night, Yates, and thank you for listening." "Good night, Olivia," he replied, not quite meeting her eyes. As he settled onto his bedroll near the fire, listening to her quiet movements as she prepared for sleep, Yates confronted the uncomfortable truth he'd been avoiding. He was falling for Olivia Winters, a widow whose husband had been dead less than a week. A woman who was, by all rights, only temporarily in his life. The realization kept him awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling as the fire's embers cast shifting shadows across the cabin walls. The next day brought an unexpected visitor. Yates was splitting wood behind the cabin when the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention. Setting down his axe, he moved to the front of the property, hand instinctively checking that his revolver was in its holster. A rider approached at a leisurely pace, and Yates relaxed slightly as he recognized Frank Johnson, his nearest neighbor. The older man raised a hand in greeting as he drew closer. "Morning, Morgan," Johnson called, reining in his horse. "Thought I'd check on you after that storm. Heard in town you had some excitement." News traveled fast in these parts, Yates reflected, not entirely pleased by the interest in his affairs. "I'm fine, Frank. Appreciate the concern." Johnson dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post. "Also heard you took in a woman and child," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp with curiosity. "Martha sent along some preserves and such, thought they might be welcome." He gestured to the saddlebags hanging from his mount. Before Yates could respond, the cabin door opened and Olivia emerged, Lillian in her arms. She wore the dress Yates had purchased in town, her hair neatly braided over one shoulder. She hesitated at the sight of the stranger, then approached cautiously. "Mrs. Winters," Yates said formally, "this is Frank Johnson. He and his wife are our nearest neighbors." "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Johnson," Olivia said, shifting Lillian to extend her hand. "I'm Olivia Winters, and this is my daughter, Lillian." Johnson removed his hat, his weathered face breaking into a smile as he shook her hand. "Madam, mighty glad to see you looking well. Martha will be pleased to hear it. We were concerned when Yates here sent that telegraph about your accident." Yates watched the exchange with mixed emotions. On one hand, it was good for Olivia to meet others in the area, to know she wasn't entirely isolated. On the other, Johnson's visit felt like an invasion of the private world they'd created in the past few days. "Why don't you come in, Mr. Johnson?" Olivia offered. "I've just made coffee, and there's fresh bread." Johnson accepted eagerly, and soon the three adults were seated at Yates's small table, with Lillian contentedly playing on a blanket nearby. Yates remained mostly silent as Olivia recounted a carefully edited version of the accident and her rescue, noting how she glossed over the details of Thomas's death while emphasizing Yates's kindness. "Well, you couldn't have been found by a better man," Johnson said approvingly. "Yates here is one of the most capable fellows in these parts, even if he keeps to himself more than most." Olivia's eyes met Yates's briefly, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Yes, I've discovered that." Johnson seemed to sense the current that passed between them, his gaze moving thoughtfully from one to the other. "Martha would love to meet you, Mrs. Winters," he said after a moment. "Perhaps you and the little one could visit us before you continue your journey. We've got grandchildren about, so there are toys and such for the baby." "That's very kind," Olivia said, glancing at Yates as if seeking his approval. "Perhaps in a few days." "Whenever you're ready," Johnson agreed, rising to his feet. "I should be getting back. Martha will skin me alive if I'm late for dinner." He tipped his hat to Olivia. "Madam, it's been a pleasure. You and your daughter are welcome at our home anytime." Yates walked Johnson out, helping him retrieve the promised preserves from his saddlebags. As the older man prepared to mount his horse, he fixed Yates with a knowing look. "She's a fine woman, Morgan," he said quietly, "and it's clear she thinks highly of you." Yates stiffened. "She's recently widowed, Frank, and only staying until she's strong enough to continue to Helena." Johnson raised an eyebrow. "Is that what she said, or what you assumed?" The question caught Yates off guard. "That was the plan from the beginning," he said, less certainly than he'd intended. "Plans change," Johnson observed mildly, "especially when hearts get involved." He mounted his horse with the ease of a man who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle. "Just something to consider." As Johnson rode away, Yates stood for a long moment, contemplating the older man's words. Was he right? Had Olivia's plans changed? More importantly, had his own? When he returned to the cabin, he found Olivia gently scolding Lillian, who had somehow managed to overturn a basket of clean laundry and was contentedly chewing on a washcloth. "I turn my back for 1 minute," Olivia was saying, though her tone held more amusement than irritation. She looked up as Yates entered, her smile widening. "Your neighbor is lovely, and these preserves?" She gestured to the jars she'd already unpacked onto the table. "Martha must be an excellent cook." "She is," Yates agreed, setting down the remaining jars. "The Johnsons are good people. They've helped me out more than once since I settled here." Olivia's expression grew thoughtful as she gathered up the scattered laundry. "It's nice having neighbors like that, people you can count on." She glanced at him. "I'm glad you have them." "They'd help you too, you know," Yates said, the words coming out before he'd fully considered them. "If you decided to stay in these parts instead of going on to Helena." Olivia's hand stilled, her eyes widening slightly. "Stay here?" Yates felt his neck growing warm. "Copper Creek's a decent town. Growing. They need a schoolteacher, the last one left to get married last spring, and there's a small house on the edge of town that's standing empty. It's not much, but it would be a roof over your head." "Yates," Olivia said softly, setting down the laundry and moving closer to him. "Are you asking me to stay?" The directness of her question left no room for evasion. Yates met her gaze squarely, knowing that his answer would change everything between them. "Yes," he said simply. "I am." Olivia's breath caught, her eyes searching his face. "Why?" It was a fair question, one that deserved an honest answer. Yates took a deep breath, allowing himself to say what he'd been feeling but had been too cautious to acknowledge. "Because in 5 days, you and Lillian have brought more life to this place than I managed in 2 years, he said. "Because I wake up each morning looking forward to the day in a way I never did before. Because—" He hesitated, then committed fully. "Because the thought of you leaving makes this cabin feel emptier than it ever did when I lived here alone." Tears welled in Olivia's eyes, but they weren't tears of sorrow. "Oh, Yates," she whispered. "I've been afraid to hope, to even think about what I was beginning to feel. It seemed too soon, too impossible." "Is it?" he asked, taking a careful step toward her. "Impossible?" Olivia shook her head, a tear spilling down her cheek. "No," she admitted, "not impossible, but complicated. I'm still in mourning. There are proprieties to consider, and Lillian adores you and you're wonderful with her," Olivia continued, "but becoming a father is no small thing. It's a lifetime commitment." "I understand that," Yates said firmly. "And I'm not asking for any promises right now. Just don't leave yet. Stay in Copper Creek. Give us time to know each other better, to see if what we're feeling might grow into something lasting." Olivia bit her lip, clearly torn. What would people think? A widow moving to town alone, known to have stayed with a single man. "Let them think what they will," Yates said, more forcefully than he'd intended. Then, softening his tone, he added, "The Johnsons can vouch for your character, and you'll have your own place in town." There'd be nothing improper about it. Lillian chose that moment to let out a happy squeal, drawing both adults' attention. She had rolled onto her stomach and was attempting to push herself up, her tiny face a study in determination. "Look at her," Olivia said, a smile breaking through her tears. So eager to move forward. Yates knelt beside the baby, gently supporting her efforts. "Smart girl," he murmured, "knows what she wants and goes after it." He looked up at Olivia. "Like her mother should." Olivia laughed softly, joining them on the floor. You play unfairly, Yates Morgan, she accused, but there was no heat in her words. Is it working? He asked, hope rising in his chest. Olivia reached out tentatively, her fingers lightly touching his. I think, she said slowly, that I would like to see this house in town. And perhaps inquire about the teaching position. It wasn't a yes, not quite, but it wasn't a no either. And for now, that was enough. 2 days later, Yates rode into Copper Creek with Olivia and Lillian. The journey had been carefully planned. Olivia rode Thunder, with Lillian securely fastened to her chest in a sling Olivia had fashioned from one of Yates's old shirts. Yates walked alongside, leading the horse and ensuring their safety every step of the way. The small house on the edge of town proved better than Yates had described: 2 rooms, with a sturdy roof and a working stove. The previous occupant, an elderly widow who had moved to live with her daughter in Oregon, had left much of the furniture behind, including a bed, table, chairs, and even a small crib that had once belonged to her grandchildren. Mayor Simmons, a portly man with a perpetual expression of mild surprise, was delighted at the prospect of a new schoolteacher. The position had been vacant for months, with the town council taking turns teaching the children as best they could. Can you start Monday next, Mrs. Winters? The mayor asked eagerly, after a brief interview in which Olivia impressed him with her educational background. The children are falling behind, especially in reading and arithmetic. Olivia glanced at Yates, who stood respectfully to one side, Lillian now dozing in his arms. I would need to arrange care for my daughter during school hours, she said. My Martha would be pleased to help with that, Mrs. Johnson interjected. She had joined them in town upon hearing of their arrival, bringing additional household items for Olivia's new home. I could take the little one during school days. Our youngest grandchild just turned 1, so I've all the necessary supplies. With that obstacle removed, Olivia agreed to the position, and arrangements were made for her to move into the house immediately. The town women, led by Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Fletcher from the general store, quickly organized to help settle Olivia and Lillian, bringing essentials, offering advice, and generally welcoming them into the community with open arms. By nightfall, Olivia stood in the center of her new home, looking both overwhelmed and pleased. Lillian had been fed and put down in the crib, which Mrs. Johnson had freshly made up with soft linens. The other women had departed, leaving Yates and Olivia alone for the first time since arriving in town. Well, Yates said, awkwardly shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Seems like you're all set. Olivia looked around the small house, which had been transformed in a matter of hours from an empty shell to a cozy home. It's more than I expected, she admitted. Everyone has been so kind. Good people here, Yates agreed. They'll look after you and Lillian. A silence fell between them, both aware that this moment marked a significant change in their relationship. No longer would they share the intimate space of Yates's cabin, no longer would they begin and end each day in each other's company. You should probably get back, Olivia said finally. It's a long walk to your place. Yates nodded, though he made no move to leave. I'll check on Thunder at the livery first, make sure he's settled in. You can use him while you're in town until you can get your own transportation. Thank you, Olivia said, moving closer. For everything, Yates. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found us that night. I'm glad I did, he said simply. Another silence, heavier than the first. Olivia broke it with a nervous laugh. This feels strange, saying goodnight to you like this, like we're strangers again. We're not strangers, Yates said firmly. We never will be again. Olivia's eyes met his, and the connection that had been building between them since that first night in the storm seemed to intensify. No, she agreed softly. We're not. Yates wanted desperately to kiss her then, to cross the invisible line they'd been dancing around for days. But propriety and respect held him back. Olivia was still in mourning, still finding her footing in this new life. Rushing her would only complicate matters. Instead, he reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. I'll come by tomorrow, help you get properly settled, he promised, and I'm never more than a few hours' ride away if you need anything at all. Olivia returned the pressure of his hand, her smile warm despite the hint of sadness in her eyes. Good night, Yates. Good night, Olivia. The walk back to his cabin in the dark was longer than Yates remembered and lonelier. For the first time in years, the solitude he'd once cherished felt hollow, the silence oppressive rather than peaceful. As he entered the empty cabin, the absence of Olivia and Lillian struck him with physical force. No baby's soft breathing, no quiet movements of Olivia preparing for bed, no subtle floral scent that somehow lingered even in a bachelor's rough dwelling. Yates built a fire more out of habit than necessity, the familiar actions failing to provide their usual comfort. As he settled into his bedroll, he wondered if he'd done the right thing, encouraging Olivia to stay in Copper Creek rather than continuing to Helena. Had he been thinking of her best interests, or merely his own desire to keep her close? Sleep came fitfully that night, his dreams filled with images of Olivia and Lillian, sometimes near, sometimes receding into the distance no matter how fast he ran after them. In town, Olivia too lay awake, listening to Lillian's soft breathing from the crib nearby. The little house was comfortable enough, and the town's welcome had been warmer than she could have hoped for. Yet something was missing: the quiet strength of Yates's presence, the sense of security she'd felt in his cabin despite its rustic simplicity. She turned onto her side, watching the moonlight filter through the simple curtains Mrs. Fletcher had hung that afternoon. Was she making a mistake, staying here instead of continuing to Helena as originally planned? John Winters would provide for them, she was certain. Thomas had often spoken of his brother's generosity and sense of family obligation, but obligation wasn't love and provision wasn't purpose. Here in Copper Creek, she had the chance to build something of her own, to teach, to contribute, to raise Lillian in a community that already seemed willing to embrace them. And then there was Yates. Strong, quiet Yates, who had never asked anything of her but had given so much. Yates, whose gentle hands could calm a frightened horse or a fussy baby with equal skill. Yates, whose blue eyes followed her movements with a warmth that made her feel both seen and cherished. It was too soon to name what was growing between them. Too soon after Thomas's death, too soon after the upheaval of her former life. But it was real, whatever it was, and for the first time in her adult life, Olivia felt the freedom to discover her own heart's desires rather than conforming to others' expectations. With that thought providing some comfort, she finally drifted into sleep, her dreams more peaceful than Yates's, filled with images of a future taking shape in this small frontier town. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm to their lives. Olivia began teaching at the small schoolhouse, quickly winning the respect of both her students and their parents with her gentle but firm approach. Lillian thrived under Mrs. Johnson's care during school hours, and the arrangement gave Olivia a freedom she'd never experienced before: the satisfaction of work that utilized her intelligence and education. Yates divided his time between his homestead and town, finding reasons to visit Copper Creek far more frequently than he ever had before. He helped Olivia with repairs to her small house, built shelves for her growing collection of books, many donated by townspeople eager to support the new teacher, and constructed a sturdy porch swing where they spent many evening hours in conversation while Lillian slept inside. Their relationship developed slowly, respectfully. Yates never presumed, never pushed. He was acutely aware of Olivia's status as a recent widow, of the town's watchful eyes, of the need to protect her reputation. But each visit strengthened the bond between them, each conversation revealing new facets of compatibility and shared values. Lillian, for her part, grew ever more attached to Yates. Her face lit up at the sound of his voice, her tiny hands reaching for him whenever he appeared. She took her first tentative steps toward him one evening in late October, wobbling across the floor of Olivia's small parlor while both adults watched in amazed delight. "Did you see that?" Olivia exclaimed as Lillian collapsed into Yates's waiting arms, giggling with accomplishment. She walked. "Actually walked, smartest little girl in the territory," Yates declared proudly, swinging Lillian up into the air as she shrieked with laughter. "Knew you could do it, sweetheart." The endearment slipped out naturally, and Yates froze momentarily, afraid he'd overstepped. But Olivia's expression held no reproach, only a soft tenderness that made his heart race. She loves you, Olivia said quietly. Sometimes I think she's more yours than Thomas's. He never had much time for her, even in the few months before. She trailed off, her gaze distant with memory. Yates settled Lillian on his knee, bouncing her gently. Thomas was her father, he said carefully. Nothing changes that. No, Olivia agreed, but being a father is more than blood, isn't it? It's presence, patience, putting someone else's needs before your own. She looked directly at him. It's what you've done for her from the beginning. The weight of her words settled over Yates, both beautiful and terrifying in their implication. Olivia, he began, uncertain how to respond. She shook her head slightly, a small smile playing at her lips. I'm not asking for anything, Yates. Just making an observation. Before he could reply, Lillian yawned widely, her eyes growing heavy despite her excitement at her new accomplishment. Olivia rose to take her, their hands brushing as the child was transferred between them. I should put her down, Olivia said. It's past her bedtime. Yates nodded, watching as Olivia carried Lillian to the small bedroom they shared. Through the partially open door, he could hear her soft murmurs as she prepared the baby for sleep, a lullaby, gentle words of love and reassurance. When she returned, Olivia seemed different, somehow more resolved, as if she'd come to a decision during those quiet moments with her daughter. Yates, she said, sitting beside him on the small sofa closer than she usually did. There's something I need to say. Yates felt his heart rate increase, unsure whether to hope or brace himself. All right, Olivia took a deep breath. When Thomas died, I thought my life was over, not just because I'd lost my husband, but because I'd lost any sense of security of knowing what the future held. She looked down at her hands, then back up to meet his eyes. I was terrified that night in the storm, not just of dying, but of failing Lillian, of not being strong enough to protect her. She reached out tentatively, her fingers lightly touching his, and then you found us. You wrapped us in your blanket, gave us shelter, asked for nothing in return. You helped me find strength I didn't know I had. Yates turned his hand to clasp hers, his calloused palm against her softer one. You already had that strength, Olivia. I just gave you a chance to recognize it. She smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Perhaps, but you also gave me something else, something I'd never truly had before. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. You gave me choice, Yates, the freedom to decide my own path without judgment or expectation. And what path are you choosing? He asked, hardly daring to hope. Olivia's gaze was steady, her voice sure despite its softness. One that includes you if you want that too. The simplicity of her declaration, the courage it took to speak those words, humbled him. Yates raised their joined hands, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. I want that more than anything, he admitted. But are you sure, Olivia? It's been barely 2 months since Thomas. I know, she interrupted gently. And I've thought about that. I've worried that it's too soon, that people will talk, that I'm dishonoring Thomas's memory. She paused. But the truth is, Thomas and I had a marriage of convenience, not passion. He was a good man in his way, but we were never truly partners. What I feel for you. She hesitated, color rising in her cheeks. It's different. It's real in a way nothing in my life has ever been before. Yates felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. Carefully, giving her every chance to pull away, he raised his free hand to cup her cheek. Olivia, he murmured, her name a prayer on his lips. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment. When they opened again, they held a clarity and certainty that took his breath away. I'm not asking for promises or declarations, she said. Just the chance to see where this leads, openly and honestly. No more pretending we're just friends, no more careful distances. People will talk, Yates warned, though he couldn't bring himself to care. Olivia's smile turned wry. People already talk, Mrs. Johnson informed me just yesterday that half the town is placing bets on when you'll propose. Yates chuckled despite himself. Is that right? And what did you tell her? I told her, Olivia said, her expression growing serious again, that when and if that day comes, it will be a private matter between you and me. The implication that she had considered such a possibility, that she hadn't dismissed it outright, sent hope surging through Yates's heart. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to turn away, he leaned forward. May I kiss you, Olivia? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Her answer was to close the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened into something more profound. Yates kept the kiss gentle despite the desire coursing through him, one hand cradling her face, the other still holding hers. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Olivia's eyes were shining. "Well," she said softly, "that answers that question." "Which question?" Yates asked, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. "Whether what I feel for you is real," she replied. "It is, Yates, very real indeed." He kissed her again, briefly but with unmistakable promise. "For me as well," he assured her, "more than I can say." They spent the remainder of the evening talking, planning, occasionally exchanging soft kisses that grew more confident as the night progressed. By the time Yates reluctantly rose to leave, propriety still demanded he not stay too late. They had reached an understanding. They would court openly but respectfully, mindful of Olivia's recent widowhood but no longer hiding the depth of their feelings. "I'll come by tomorrow," Yates promised as he stood on her small porch, reluctant to leave despite the late hour. "Help you fix that loose window before winter sets in properly." Olivia smiled, leaning against the doorframe. "I'll expect you for supper then. 6 o'clock. I'll be here," he assured her, stealing one last kiss before descending the steps. As he walked toward the livery where Thunder was stabled, Yates felt lighter than he had in years. The future, which had once seemed a bleak expanse of solitary existence, now held promise and possibility. And at the center of that promise were Olivia and Lillian, a family he'd never sought but now couldn't imagine living without. Winter came early to Montana that year, the first heavy snow falling before Thanksgiving. The townsfolk of Copper Creek took it in stride, well accustomed to the harsh realities of frontier winters. The schoolhouse remained open, though attendance sometimes dwindled when outlying farms were snowbound. Olivia proved adept at adjusting her teaching to accommodate the fluctuating student population, often sending work home with older siblings for the younger children who couldn't make the journey. For Yates, the snow meant a change in routine. Trapping became his primary source of income, the pelts bringing good prices as demand for warm furs increased. He made the journey between his cabin and town less frequently, but stayed longer when he did come, often spending several days helping with community projects like reinforcing the church roof against the weight of snow or chopping firewood for elderly residents. These extended stays in town allowed his relationship with Olivia to deepen further. They spent every available moment together, whether sharing meals, reading by the fire while Lillian played at their feet, or joining in community gatherings at the church or town hall. The townspeople, far from gossiping maliciously about their relationship, seemed to have collectively decided that Yates and Olivia belonged together. Invitations were always extended to both of them, seating at social functions invariably arranged to place them side by side. Christmas approached, bringing with it a flurry of preparations. The school children presented a pageant under Olivia's direction, with Lillian now toddling confidently and babbling a growing vocabulary serving as the youngest angel in the nativity scene. Yates sat in the front row, his chest swelling with pride as he watched Olivia guide her students through the performance, her natural grace and patience evident in every interaction. "She's a fine teacher," Sheriff Calloway commented, sitting beside Yates. "Town's lucky to have her." "Yes, we are," Yates agreed, his eyes never leaving Olivia. Calloway chuckled knowingly. "Got something special planned for Christmas, I hear." Yates shot him a sharp look. "Where'd you hear that? Small town," the sheriff shrugged, echoing his words from months before. "Mrs. Johnson mentioned you'd been by the jewelers in Helena last time you took furs to market." Yates sighed, shaking his head. "Can't a man have any secrets around here?" "Not many," Calloway admitted cheerfully. "But for what it's worth, there's not a soul in Copper Creek who doesn't think you two are perfectly matched." The observation, delivered with genuine warmth, eased some of the nervousness Yates had been feeling about his Christmas plans. He'd indeed visited a jeweler during his last trip to Helena, spending a considerable portion of his trapping profits on a ring, a simple gold band, set with a small but flawless sapphire that reminded him of Montana's summer sky. It rested now in his coat pocket, a constant reminder of the question he intended to ask on Christmas morning. Not too soon, he decided, despite the sheriff's teasing. Nearly 4 months had passed since Thomas Winters' death, a respectable period of mourning given the circumstances. And while Olivia still occasionally wore black, she had gradually introduced other colors back into her wardrobe, a silent signal of her transition from grief to healing. More importantly, Yates was certain of his feelings and increasingly confident of hers. The way Olivia looked at him when he entered a room, the way she leaned into his embrace, the way she included him in decisions about Lillian's upbringing all spoke of a woman who had made her choice and was comfortable with it. On Christmas Eve, a heavy snow began falling in the late afternoon, large flakes drifting lazily from a pearl-gray sky. The town's Christmas celebration at the church ended early, families hurrying home to beat the worst of the weather. Yates escorted Olivia and Lillian to their house, carrying the sleeping toddler while Olivia held a lantern high to light their path through the thickening snow. "Will you stay?" Olivia asked as they reached her porch, stamping snow from their boots. "The storm's getting worse." "I don't like the thought of you trying to reach the livery in this." The invitation was practical rather than suggestive. They both knew the dangers of a Montana blizzard all too well. Still, it represented a new level of trust between them. Yates had never spent the night under Olivia's roof, mindful always of her reputation and the proprieties they both respected. "If you're sure," he said, adjusting Lillian in his arms as the child murmured in her sleep. "I could take the sofa." Olivia unlocked the door, holding it wide for him to enter with his precious burden. "The sofa it is," she agreed, though her eyes held a warmth that made his heart race despite the chill. They settled Lillian in her crib, the toddler never fully waking as Olivia deftly changed her into a nightgown and tucked warm blankets around her. Yates watched from the doorway, struck anew by Olivia's gentle competence as a mother, by the love evident in every touch and murmured word. When she joined him in the main room, Olivia moved to stoke the fire, adding logs to build it back to a cheerful blaze. "Are you hungry?" she asked. "There's leftover stew I could heat." "No need," Yates assured her, removing his coat and hanging it carefully on a peg near the door, mindful of its precious cargo. "We ate plenty at the church supper." Olivia smiled, settling onto the sofa and patting the space beside her. "Then come sit with me. It's Christmas Eve after all. We should enjoy it." Yates joined her, his arm naturally finding its way around her shoulders as she leaned into his side. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving snow against the windows in soft pattering sounds that only emphasized the warmth and comfort within. "I have something for you," Olivia said after a comfortable silence. "For Christmas, but I'm not sure I can wait until morning." Yates chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That makes 2 of us, though I was planning to be traditional about it." Olivia shifted to look up at him, her eyes sparkling in the firelight. "Where's the fun in that? Besides, tomorrow will be all about Lillian, tonight can be ours." The suggestion, innocent though it was, sent a pleasant warmth through Yates's chest. "All right," he agreed, "you first." Olivia rose, moving to the small desk in the corner where she kept school papers and personal correspondence. From a drawer, she withdrew a package wrapped in simple brown paper and tied with a red ribbon. She returned to the sofa, handing it to him with an expression that mingled excitement and nervousness. "It's not much," she cautioned as he began to unwrap it, "but I hope you'll like it." Inside was a book, its leather cover worn but well cared for. Yates opened it carefully, finding it filled with handwritten poems and short reflections, the penmanship delicate and precise. "It's yours," he realized, looking up at her in wonder. "You wrote these?" Olivia nodded, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Since I was a girl." "It was my secret, something just for me. Thomas never knew about it." She hesitated. "No one did until now." Yates understood immediately the significance of the gift. Olivia was sharing a part of herself that she'd kept hidden from everyone else in her life, trusting him with her most private thoughts and creative expressions. The intimacy of it moved him deeply. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll treasure this, Olivia." and the trust it represents. She smiled, clearly relieved by his response. Read them whenever you're at your cabin missing us. It might make the distance more bearable. Nothing makes the distance bearable, Yates admitted, but this will help. He carefully set the book aside, then reached for his coat. Now it's my turn. His hand found the small box in the pocket, and for a moment doubt assailed him. Was this too soon? Too presumptuous? But the love shining in Olivia's eyes as she watched him steadied his resolve. Olivia, he began, returning to sit beside her. These past months have been the happiest of my life. Finding you and Lillian that night, bringing you into my home, it changed everything for me. He took her hand in his, drawing strength from the warmth of her touch. I was existing before, not living, going through the motions day to day with no real purpose beyond my own survival. His voice grew more confident as he continued. You gave me purpose again. You and Lillian showed me what it means to truly care for someone, to put their needs before my own. Olivia's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her smile was radiant. Oh, Yates, she whispered, you did the same for us. You saved us in more ways than you know. We saved each other, he acknowledged, and I want to keep doing that every day for the rest of our lives. With that, he opened the small box, revealing the sapphire ring nestled within. Olivia Winters, will you marry me? Will you and Lillian make a family with me? A tear spilled down Olivia's cheek as she gazed at the ring, then back at his face. Yes, she said without hesitation, her voice clear despite her emotion. Yes, Yates, with all my heart, yes. His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the sapphire catching the firelight like a captured star. Olivia examined it with wonder, then launched herself into his arms, her kiss conveying all the joy and love that words couldn't express. When they finally parted, both breathless and flushed, Yates held her close, his cheek pressed against her hair. I was going to wait until morning, he admitted. Do it properly with Lillian there too. Olivia laughed softly. This was perfect, and we can tell Lillian together tomorrow. She leaned back to look at him, her expression suddenly thoughtful. Where will we live? Here at your cabin? I've been thinking about that, Yates said, having anticipated the question. The Petersons' place, just outside town. Old Jacob's looking to sell now that his sons have moved to Oregon. It's a good property, better than mine, closer to town so you could keep teaching if you want to. Big enough for a proper family, he hesitated, if that appeals to you. It sounds wonderful, Olivia said, her fingers absently tracing patterns on his chest. But your cabin, I know how much it means to you, your independence. Yates captured her hand, bringing it to his lips. It's just a place, Olivia. Home is where you and Lillian are. Besides, he added with a small smile, we could keep the cabin too, use it in summers or when we want to get away from town for a while. Olivia's eyes lit up at the suggestion. I'd like that. It's where we began, after all. Where we began, Yates agreed, pulling her closer. And this is just the start of our story, Olivia, the very beginning. Outside, the storm continued to rage, snow piling high against the windows and door. But inside, wrapped in each other's arms before the crackling fire, Yates and Olivia were warmer than they'd ever been, their hearts full of love and their future as bright as the stars hidden behind the snowy clouds. They were married on New Year's Day, a date chosen both for its symbolism and practicality. The schoolhouse was closed for the holiday, and most of the town was free to attend. The ceremony took place in the small church, which had been decorated with evergreen boughs and red berries, remnants of the Christmas celebrations adding festive cheer to the simple setting. Olivia wore a dress of deep blue velvet, specially ordered from Helena and delivered just in time by a determined stage driver who'd battled through snow-choked passes to reach Copper Creek. She carried Lillian on her hip as she walked down the aisle, the toddler resplendent in a matching dress and behaving with surprising decorum for a child not yet 18 months old. Yates, waiting at the altar in a new suit that felt stiff and foreign compared to his usual attire, felt his breath catch at the sight of them, his bride and the little girl who would soon legally be his daughter as well. They were more beautiful than anything he'd ever seen, and the knowledge that they were choosing him, that they would be his family, humbled him beyond words. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, the aging minister beaming as he pronounced them husband and wife. When Yates kissed his bride, Lillian clapped her hands in delight, causing a ripple of laughter through the assembled townsfolk. It was, everyone agreed afterward, the most joyous wedding Copper Creek had seen in many years. The celebration continued at the town hall, where tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes contributed by nearly every household. There was dancing, music provided by local fiddlers, and enough goodwill to warm the coldest January day. Even Sheriff Calloway unbent enough to take a turn on the dance floor, partnering Mrs. Johnson while Frank Johnson played a lively reel on his harmonica. "Happy, Mrs. Morgan?" Yates asked as they shared a quiet moment away from the festivities, Lillian having fallen asleep in Mrs. Fletcher's arms after the excitement of the day. Olivia's smile was answer enough, but she rose on tiptoe to kiss him softly. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she assured him. "And you, any regrets about giving up your bachelor ways?" Yates pulled her closer, his arms encircling her waist. "Only that I didn't find you sooner," he murmured against her hair. "Think of all the time we could have had." "We have now," Olivia reminded him, her hand coming to rest over his heart, "and all the days to come." When the celebration finally wound down in the late afternoon, the newlyweds collected a sleeping Lillian and made their way not to Olivia's small house in town, but to Yates's cabin. They had decided to spend their first week as a married couple there, away from well-meaning neighbors and the demands of town life. It was fitting somehow, returning to the place where their story had begun that stormy night months before. The cabin had been prepared for their arrival, thanks to Frank Johnson, who had ridden out the day before to stock the pantry and ensure the place was warm and welcoming. A new bed had replaced Yates's old one, a wedding gift from the Johnsons, and a small trundle for Lillian had been tucked into the corner. As Yates carried the still sleeping toddler across the threshold, followed by Olivia with a lantern held high against the early winter darkness, he was struck by how different the cabin felt now compared to the last time he'd been there alone. What had once seemed adequate now felt rich with possibility, the simple spaces transformed by the presence of the two people he loved most in the world. Olivia must have sensed his thoughts, for she slipped her arm around his waist as they stood in the center of the main room, Lillian breathing softly against his shoulder. "It feels like coming home," she said quietly, "even though I was only here a few days." "It is home," Yates replied, turning to look down at her. "Our home for as long as we want it to be." Later, after Lillian had been settled in her trundle bed and they had shared a simple supper by lamplight, Yates and Olivia stood on the porch, wrapped in a single blanket against the cold. The storm of their first meeting was a distant memory, replaced now by a clear winter night where stars blazed overhead like diamonds scattered across black velvet. "I never thanked you properly," Olivia said, breaking a comfortable silence, "for finding us that night. For wrapping us in your blanket, for everything that followed." Yates tightened his arm around her, drawing her closer against the chill. "You never needed to thank me," he said. "Finding you and Lillian was the greatest gift of my life." Olivia turned in his arms, her face tilted up to his. In the starlight, her eyes held a depth of feeling that took his breath away. "I love you, Yates Morgan," she said simply, "with all that I am, and I love you, Olivia Morgan," he replied, the new name still a wonder on his tongue. "More than I have words to say." Their kiss, tender yet passionate, sealed the promises they had made that day, promises not just of fidelity and partnership, but of a shared purpose, a life built together through whatever challenges the frontier might bring. As they returned to the warmth of the cabin, to the beginning of their first night as husband and wife, both knew with certainty that the storm that had brought them together had been not a disaster, but a blessing, the catalyst for a love neither had expected, but which both now recognized as the foundation of their lives. In the years that followed, the Morgan story became something of a legend in Copper Creek, and beyond the tale of a cowboy who found a frail woman alone in a storm, wrapped her in his blanket, and discovered in that act of kindness a new purpose that transformed both their lives. Yates and Olivia purchased the Peterson property as planned, turning it into a thriving small ranch while maintaining the cabin as a summer retreat. Olivia continued teaching until the birth of their first son, William, a year after their marriage. A daughter, Emma, followed 2 years later, completing their family. Lillian grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's grace and her adoptive father's quiet strength. She never remembered Thomas Winters, knowing only Yates as her father, a fact that filled him with both pride and humble gratitude. When she married at 18, it was Yates who walked her down the aisle, his chest swelling with emotion as he placed her hand in that of a young rancher who looked at her with the same devotion Yates still felt for Olivia. As for Olivia, she blossomed in the freedom of her new life, discovering talents and strengths she'd never been allowed to express in her first marriage. She became known throughout the region for her educational advocacy, eventually helping to establish the first proper school building in Copper Creek, with multiple classrooms and a small library named in her honor. And on stormy nights, when wind howled around the eaves of their home and rain lashed at the windows, Yates and Olivia would sit by the fire, sometimes alone, sometimes surrounded by their children and later grandchildren, and retell the story of that first night of a desperate journey through the darkness, of a chance encounter that proved to be destiny, of a simple wool blanket that became the first thread in the fabric of their shared life. It wasn't chance, Olivia would always insist, her hand finding Yates's as naturally as breathing. It was providence. And Yates, looking at the family they had built together, at the love that had only deepened with each passing year, could only agree. For in the vast wilderness of the Montana Territory, amid the harsh realities of frontier life, they had found in each other not just shelter from the storm, but the very purpose of their existence.